So my talk today is based on a book I published a couple of years ago about early women pioneers in Wall Street, early women investors, and some early women brokers. So there weren't a lot of those. Slide. So today, Wall Street looms large in the American imagination. We take it for granted as a symbol of American capitalism, and it's a key indicator of economic health. But this is a relatively new phenomenon. It was only in the 1870s, in the decade following the Civil War, that Wall Street burst onto the national consciousness. A tremendous expansion of the stock market took place to finance the building of railroads and industrial development. The capital needed to support massive corporations like the Pennsylvania Railroad or U.S. Steel or AT&T was raised by selling stocks and bonds on American stock exchanges, especially the New York Stock Exchange. These financial securities became an important investment outlet for wealthy and middle-class Americans, women as well as men. A national securities market spread out from Wall Street and across the country. The invention of the stock ticker in 1867, and you can see a man standing next to a stock ticker at the right of that image, but the invention of the stock ticker in 1867 meant that share prices were now available nationwide, transmitted instantaneously and continuously via the telegraph wires. While American business depended on the stock market, Wall Street had a bad reputation among ordinary Americans. Stock market crashes occurred at regular intervals: 1873, 1884, 1893, 1907, and of course 1929, leading to economic recession and in some cases wiping out people's savings. Muckraking journalists of the progressive era delighted in exposing the corrupt business practices of Wall Street tycoons like Cornelius Vanderbilt, Jay Gould, or Daniel Drew, the founder of Drew University. Many Christians also believed that making money on the rise or fall of shares was gambling, that honest people should work for their money. It was bad enough that men engaged in stock gambling, but the thought that women might speculate in shares was especially offensive to conservatives. Women were expected to behave with greater modesty and self-control and to set a moral example for men. So Wall Street also had a reputation as a hyper-masculine environment. In many ways, it still does. In Victorian America, women stock market investors and financiers were not supposed to exist, but they did. Right? So, for example, in September of 1882, the New York Times observed, quote, "Wall Street is overrun with women, women who are old and women who are young, women who are poorly clad and women in rich attire, women attractive and women repulsive, all with an eye single to gain." So although we know that there were women involved in the stock market early on, finding out about these women is especially difficult, and that's really what my project was about. And of course, this is an image of a 19th century stock exchange, and you can see sort of in the right corner, there's one woman present, but of course this is a fictitious image. No woman would actually be allowed on the floor of a stock exchange in the 19th century. So slide. This image dramatizes the extraordinary situation of businesswomen 100 years ago. There are few of them, and they're not easy to find. It's almost like you can see the one woman in the picture in the white blouse. It's almost like Where's Waldo or Where's Mabel? There are not that many of them, and they're not easy to find. This is an image of the sales staff of Prudential Insurance Company around 1900. So a New Jersey-based corporation, one of the most important financial service industries, financial service companies in the country. So pioneering women investors and financiers are still hard to locate in historical records that have survived. And of course, a lot haven't survived. Business history was not taken seriously as an academic discipline until the 1930s, and women's history not until the 1960s. Libraries and archives were mostly uninterested in acquiring materials related to either business or women, let alone businesswomen. Most businesses, including long-lived corporations, have been slow to recognize the historical value of their records. A great deal has been thrown away, and a lot is still not available to outside researchers. Slide. Even finding images of women on Wall Street from a century ago is really hard. Here's an image of a woman from the late 1800s posing with a stock ticker. It's obviously a posed image. This photograph has survived, but no information about it has survived. So why was it taken? What's the story behind it? We just don't know. Slide. This is the image, the cover image used for my book, which I found. It's an old advertisement for a brand of cigarettes called Preferred Stock cigarettes. So the idea, so it was like cigarettes being promoted for businessmen, and it's the Duke Tobacco Company, right? The people who brought us Duke University, but it's meant to be a bit of a joke, right? This woman posing with a stock ticker. Slide. Here's another kind of image. This was a popular Broadway musical from 1912 called The Wall Street Girl. And the play was a lighthearted romp in which a brokeress, depicted here, saves her father from bankruptcy through a lucky investment, and then she happily gives up the stock exchange to marry her sweetheart. Right? So, happy ending. Slide. Or this is kind of sarcastic slide, right? It's women with stock takes coming out of their mouths, right? It's like women are such gossips. The ticker should just come right out of their mouths. So, but it's this assumption that women in stock tickers were like fish out of water. They didn't really go together. They weren't in their natural element, kind of like a monkey on a bicycle. In her 1863 book, The Employments of Women, Virginia Penny, who was usually very eager to promote new fields of employment for women, she noted in 1863 with approval that there were no women stockbrokers in the United States. And Virginia Penny argued, quote, women could not very well conduct the business without having to mix promiscuously with men on the street, and to stop and talk to them in the most public places, and the delicacy of woman would forbid that. So there's this, this Victorian ideal that probably a lot of you are familiar with, this idea of separate spheres that posited that men and women each had their own natural, God-given spheres of activity. Woman's was the home and motherhood, and man's was everything else, right? Politics, business, the profession. So the idea was that business activity would prevent a woman from fulfilling her natural functions, or it would corrupt a woman from her natural purity. Hold your questions till the end. We'll have plenty of time for that. Slide. So this is a cartoon from 1870, where the very idea of a woman stockbroker was seen as just a joke. And at the bottom it says "Woman in Wall Street," and "Lady broker to applicant for stock. Oh dear, how can I attend to business when I have the baby to mind?" So it's not subtle, right? So the idea was that the stock market was too volatile for women's emotional natures. As one magazine article from the era argued, quote, to subject the highly keyed nervous systems of the average woman to stock gambling is little short of a crime. Slide. So there's another illustration from a magazine from the early 20th century. It's called Women in a Panic. And this idea is, this is what Wall Street would be like if you had a lot of women dealing in shares. The minute there was a downturn in stocks, they'd be running around screaming like chickens with their heads cut off. Of course, the implication being when there's a stock market crash, the men are all cool as cucumbers, right? They're not jumping out of windows or anything like that. But that's the kind of argument that you're being made a lot at the time, in the late 1800s and the early 20th century, which is really the period I'm focusing on. So the idea was that the only kind of woman who would want to enter Wall Street or be involved in these kinds of activities were brazen, immoral women who had rejected their proper sphere. Slide. Women like Victoria Woodhull and her sister Tennessee Claflin, who became America's first women stockbrokers in 1870. The business was short-lived, and it was ended by a sexual scandal. Slide. Here Woodhull, and this is a cartoon from the period when they opened their business in lower Manhattan in 1870. Here Woodhull and her sister drive a chariot pulled by bulls and bears over the hapless bodies of male investors. While trying to earn a living on Wall Street, Woodhull alienated male financiers by exposing their corrupt business practices. She and her sister also had a ran a progressive newspaper. So she was kind of trying to have it both ways. She wanted to be a stockbroker and be successful in finance, but she also ran this kind of early muckraking newspaper which exposed the corruption of Wall Street. I mean, part of her argument is the reason Wall Street's corrupt is because it's run by men, but if more women like me were involved, it wouldn't be so corrupt. It would be more fairly run. We're still waiting for that to happen, right? So Woodhull and her sister in turn, or rather the male stockbrokers who she criticized, denounced her as an impudent and an immoral woman. It turned out she was divorced. And she also advocated what was called free love at the time, which was seen as fairly scandalous. Slide. There's a cartoon from 1875 that's clearly meant to depict Woodhull and her sister, and it imagines women brokers as little better than prostitutes. It's called Female Brokers Securing a Customer, and the man looks suspiciously like Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was rumored to have an association with Woodhull and her sister, but basically it's the idea the only way a woman can succeed on Wall Street was by using her sexual wiles, her feminine wiles, to seduce men to buy stocks from her. So one of the women you can see, if you look really closely, is holding a stock certificate, but they're plying him with champagne and caressing him. And so, yeah, again, this implication that it's only immoral women or women behaving immorally who could succeed in business. Slide. There's another kind of meant to be humorous or slightly racy postcard from the early 20th century, Wall Street sensation, right? It's another eroticized image. The Wall Street was assumed to be a masculine space. The mere presence of a woman was enough to cause a sensation, especially when she's showing a little ankle as she's crossing the street. Right? So there was no shortage of such negative images and ideas. There was also a lot of prescriptive literature, a lot of advice literature warning women away from the stock market as being not only an immoral place, but also a dangerous place for women. Slide. So, I mean, for one example, Henry Clews was a very famous New York stockbroker who published his memoirs in 1881 about his life on Wall Street. It was full of all kinds of interesting anecdotes and stories, but he also included a number of stories about what he considered women's financial incompetence. And he insisted, for example, quote, "Women do not seem to have the mental qualities required to take up the varied points of the situation upon which success in speculation depends. They are like a ship at sea in a heavy gale without compass, anchor, or rudder. They have no ballast apart from men, and are likely to perish when adversity arises." So financial advice books for women encourage them to entrust their affairs to a male relation. Victorian novels also were full of sad stories about women who lost their fortunes or who lost their reputations on Wall Street. So part of what I do in my book is look at all of these kind of negative images and all this advice literature telling women to stay away from Wall Street. And I think for a long time, historians have assumed that women were probably inhibited by this and intimidated by all this negativity. But, were they? Were they really? And clearly there were women who were interested in Wall Street, and there were women investors. So, clearly all of this sort of advice for women to stay away wasn't really working. Slide. And, there's a lot of evidence that women were investing in Wall Street. Here's another image. This is an image from an American magazine in the 1890s, which depicts a stock brokerage business specifically catering to women. You see women sitting around a stock ticker. You see a stock quotation board there. So we know that there were women investors, and that there were women who advised and worked for women investors. These are mostly, of course, middle class or upper class women who had money to invest. But finding out about these women is the hard part. This is the difficult part, as I said, because so little evidence about this has survived. Slide. Of course, another problem or issue that women had to overcome, besides just all the negativity telling them to stay away from the stock market, is that until the 19th century, women had very little control over property. The United States inherited from our English colonial overlords, English common law, which has a very ancient doctrine of coverture. Under English common law, married women did not have a separate legal identity. So married women couldn't sign a contract. A married woman couldn't make a will. Any property a woman had when she got married automatically became her husband's property, unless there was some kind of prenuptial agreement, which those were only the sorts of things engaged in by very wealthy and aristocratic families. So most middle-class families where women had money before they got married, and they got married, that money automatically became their husband's. If their family, if her relatives left her money, that was her husband's control. If a woman worked for wages, most middle-class women didn't, but working-class women who worked for wages, those wages could be paid to her husband. He had control over her wages. So in the 18th and 19th centuries, there are increasing objections to this by women, and there's an organized women's movement that's beginning in the 19th century, both in England and the United States, which is pushing back against these restrictions of coverture. And so we can see that it's starting to be overturned bit by bit. Of course, every state in America had different laws with regard to marriage. And I'm just giving you the information for New Jersey, right? So before 1852, married women in New Jersey had no right to separate property. Now, single women did. If you were single, you could use your property any way you wanted to, like a single man. But of course, most women were married. Most people were married in the 19th century. So it's only in 1852 that women in New Jersey who got married would have a right to keep property they had before marriage. The laws were not retroactive. So all women, women married before 1852, they had lost all that property and they weren't getting it back. They weren't getting control over it. It wasn't until 1874 that married women could inherit property. So even after 1852, if you got married after 1852, any property as a woman you had you could keep and your husband didn't have control over, but if your family left you property, that would go to him and he would have control over it until 1874. And it wasn't until 1896 that New Jersey women who worked for wages, who were married, could keep that money. Now, your husband could let you keep that money if he wanted to, if he was a nice guy, but he didn't have to. He could go to your boss and just tell your boss that you pay my wife's wages on Saturday to me. And legally, he'd be required to do so until 1896. So, New Jersey was not quite as good as New England states. New England states tended to pass these laws a little bit earlier, but New Jersey was much better than, say, southern states that were quite far behind. And the worst example I can give you is Georgia, where in Georgia it wasn't until 1845 that married women had a right to their own wages. Rather, 1945. 1945, it was not until 1945 that Georgia women who worked for wages, who were married, had the right to those wages. So that's the worst example I can give. Okay. So how do we find, so by the mid 1800s, women in New Jersey, married women, single women who had money, could do with that money what they wanted. And if they wanted to buy stocks and bonds with it, they were free to do so, and we know that some of them did. But how do we find out about what kinds of stocks and bonds these women bought? That's really hard to find out. Slide. I don't know if anyone can identify this person. There's no reason why you should. He was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, of the Union Navy, during the Civil War. Okay, that's not surprising. The only reason, next. The reason I bring him up is this was his marriage settlement. If you can read this. He married a woman named Virginia Woodbury in 1854. Marriage settlements were very common among middle-class and upper-class people in the 19th century. Unfortunately, very few of them survive. So basically, this was a document that was drawn up at the time of the marriage in which both families would list, this is the money the man has, this is the money the woman has. And especially that was important once you had married women's property laws, because it was like, this is the money the woman's bringing to the marriage, and this is money she will have control over after the marriage. And I say, these were once very common among people with property, but hardly any of them have survived. And the only reason this one survived is because he was a famous naval celebrity, and his personal papers got kept because of his importance as a political figure, so we just happened fortuitously to have some of these personal financial documents, which in most families would have long since been thrown away. But what I point out here is what this sort of shows, and I'm not saying this is typical, but it's probably more typical than not. The bride, that is Virginia Woodbury, brought 5 times more capital to the marriage than the groom, and her money earned 8 times more than his. But of course, what you have to counterbalance against this is that he, the man, would bring in additional money to the marriage through his salary, first as a naval officer and later as a lawyer. He was also a lawyer. And these are economic opportunities that were barred to women. So men, middle-class men in particular, there were lots of ways they could make money. There were not that many ways that middle-class women could earn money. So therefore, investment income, owning stocks and bonds, was probably more important for middle-class women than it was for middle-class men. For a lot of middle-class men, it was a way to earn extra money. But for some of these women, it was that's what they lived on, especially if they weren't married. Or it was money that they had that they could use separate from their husband's money. Slide. Another obscure. Harrison and Morton. I don't know if that rings any bells either. This Benjamin Harrison, not one of our more distinguished presidents. And of course, his vice president, Levi Morton. I don't know anyone who could get that in a Trivial Pursuit. I wouldn't have known that. Levi Morton. Yes, Vice President Levi Morton. Levi Morton was a stockbroker in New York. That's why it's important to me. And he was part of a stockbroking firm in the late 19th century called Morton and Bliss. But like, Gustavus Fox, because he was a vice president of the United States, the New York Historical Society wanted his personal papers. Most of the time, a stockbroker in New York dies in the 19th century, and his family just throws all of his books away. Historical societies and libraries didn't think that stuff. It was just money-grubbing, business records. They didn't think that had any historical value. But because Morton had been vice president of the United States, the New York Historical Society has all of his stock ledgers and all of his correspondence with his customers, many of whom were women. So this is an accidental way in which these business records got preserved because of who he was. So, and they give us a lot of insights into how people invested their money, but in the case of what I'm interested in right now, or for the book I did, about how women invested their money. Almost a third of Levi Morton's customers were women, which seems surprising, right? I mean, women are half the population, but of course, in the 19th century, women didn't control half the nation's wealth, right? Women had a lot less money than men. So the fact that a third of his customers were women, I think, I found that a little surprising. Slide. And here's one of his customers, his account book from 1886, a New Jersey woman, Mary Orton, who lived in Jersey City. And this shows you how a middle-class woman, some typical way in which her capital was invested. She had about $30,000. That was a nice chunk of change in 1886. And it was divided between, she had owned 50 bonds in the Union Pacific Railroad, 50 bonds in the Missouri and Iowa Railroad. Railroads were the most common thing that everyone invested in at that time. And then she owned 200 shares in the Bank of New Haven. So on average, she would get about $1,500 a year. Now put that in perspective, a male factory worker at this time would make about $900 a year. And that would be money he would have to probably support a whole family on. So a single woman getting $1,500 a year could live comfortably, not lavishly, but comfortably on that. A married woman who had $1,500 a year, that was a lot of, like, as I would say, pin money, right? Because conventionally the husband would pay household expenses out of his salary, out of his money. So the $1,500 a year that she had, if she were a married woman, and Mary Orton was a married woman, this was money she could use for whatever she wanted to buy clothes, to buy presents, to buy stocks, to invest in real estate if she wanted to. Okay. A slide. This is another customer. It's hard to find, of course, images of these women. So this is one of the few Morton Bliss customers, one of Levi Morton's women investors I was able to find information about, to find an image of. When she died, her husband wrote a biography of her, right, which he self-published. He was a judge, and included this image. And this is very syrupy, typical Victorian kind of autobiography about what a lovely angelic woman my wife was and what a good religious woman she was. And he puts in all this information about what her favorite Bible verses were. And when they went to Niagara Falls for the first time, she was so overcome by the beauty of God's creation, she fell upon her knees. It's like, okay, if all you knew about her was what you read in this book, you would think she was this very conventional, very pious Victorian woman. But what I know about her was her relationship with her stockbroker And she was a ruthless investor, right? She was constantly writing to her stockbroker about, no, 5% is not good enough. I want 7% interest and sell this and buy this. So, maybe to her husband and the image that he wants to present to the world is this conventional kind of passive religious woman, but she had money invested, and she had money invested very well, and she was not just letting her stockbroker invest the money as he saw fit. She was very actively involved in how that money was invested. And so, working with her stockbroker, she accumulated a vast portfolio of investments in railroads, coal mines, mortgages, and New York real estate. Okay. So, but confident and well-informed investors like Emily Billings have largely been forgotten by history. What mostly survives are the negative depictions of women investors in novels and financial literature, right? Mostly written by men. Finding information about people like her was a real godsend to my project. Something else that was helpful was that the recent digitalization of thousands of newspapers around the country has made it possible to uncover information about pioneering women financiers who have long been forgotten. And probably 10 years ago, I couldn't even have done this project, so thank you. Thank you to the Mormons for doing all of that work that they do for genealogical purposes, but for historians, we can use it for all kinds of things. Slide. So here's a woman I uncovered who'd been completely forgotten, Grace Cortland. She was a stockbroker in the 1880s, and she also, I think, sort of following in Victoria Woodhull's footsteps, because she was interested in making money on the stock exchange, but she also was interested in exposing what she saw as the corrupt practices of the robber barons. So she took up this Victoria Woodhull's mantle, and she was a very colorful figure. Like Victoria Woodhull, I don't think I mentioned this, before she became a stockbroker, Grace Cortland was a spiritualist. That is, she communicated with the dead through seances, which in the 1800s was not considered completely crackpot. There was a lot of respectable following to that. Now, some people did think it was a little crazy, but it was not considered entirely crazy. Grace Cortland audaciously dubbed herself the Witch of Wall Street. She called herself the Witch of Wall Street, right? You can see in very small, in print underneath where it says Grace Cortland, it says in quotation marks, the Witch of Wall Street. So she actually, she coined that term for herself. She had already achieved considerable notoriety for horsewhipping a man in public for, as she said, seducing her daughter. So she brought this same ferocity to bear in denouncing the monopolistic practices of men like Vanderbilt. In November of 1881, Grace Cortland gave a speech in New York City, which she called the Kings of Wall Street, in which she blasted the nation's leading financiers, who she said their only desire was to, quote, filch from the poor and to control the national finance for their own selfish ends. This speech was published, so that's what we see right here. And she toured the country, giving talks about this, about denouncing Wall Street to very large crowds. Because once you got out of New York, once you got into the heartland, you found a lot of people who were very receptive to that, who saw New York as just full of corruption. And of course, a lot of people in the American heartland still think that way about New York. Probably think that way about New Jersey, too. Slide. It's another long-forgotten stockbroker who I uncovered, Sophronia Twitchell. Great name. She was also a women's rights advocate turned stockbroker. She first worked as an agent for insurance companies in San Francisco, where she speculated heavily and successfully in mining shares. In 1880, she moved to New York, where at the age of 50, she opened a brokerage business for women on Lower Broadway and made a great deal of money. Twitchell was unpopular with male brokers, who may have resented her success and certainly resented her manner, which was unusually forthright and outspoken. Once, when a businessman ordered her out of his offices, she hit him with her umbrella and was arrested for assault. She was frequently mocked as a, quote, crazy crank. One newspaper story described her as, quote, tall, fat, and 50. You're like 50, that was just like, like ancient and decrepit, right? She dresses, okay, this is the same newspaper article, right? She dresses in wretched taste, wears an old-fashioned shawl and a bonnet that would give a woman of taste the hysterics. So it's like, proper women, right, aren't going to be interested in this. The very fact that she's a women's rights advocate, right? She's pushy and loud. She dresses badly. It's like, this is just this is what business does to women, right? It makes them mannish, or it makes them unwomanly, or else she was already that way, and that's what attracted her to business. So not a good, proper lady would not be interested in this kind of thing. So Twitchell, she was clearly an intimidating and a bewildering presence, and businessmen didn't know how to deal with her. They tried variously to freeze her out, or to just discredit her as a kind of unwomanly freak. Slide. This is a person who could not be discredited because she was one of the richest people in the United States. She was one of the richest people in the world, Hetty Green. Now, this may be a name that some people have heard of. She certainly was not a person discovered by me, though I discovered a lot of new information about her. She was the most successful and famous woman financier of the Gilded Age. She was a New England whale oil heiress. It's a mouthful. Whale oil heiress turned Wall Street tycoon. So she parlayed a modest fortune. She inherited a couple $1 million from her family, but she, over the years, turned that into more than $100 million through very aggressive and shrewd investments in real estate and railroads in the decades following the Civil War. A fearless speculator, she made millions in the stock market by buying at times of financial panic. And she would do things like Chicago was burned down by the Great Fire in 1872, and Hetty Green would go into Chicago and just buy up half the city, these burnt out lots. She knew that was going to go up in price. Or in San Francisco after the earthquake, she went up and just bought up real estate all over the place. So she had this foresight and the courage to do that, and to people would always say, she would say, oh, it's easy to get rich on Wall Street. You just buy when stocks are low and you sell when they're high. It's like, yeah, well, it's easier said than done, right? When stocks are plummeting, most people are panicking and selling, It takes a real person with a backbone to go in and start buying up when they're low like that. But she did that, right? She was, of course, a controversial figure. Her detractors labeled her the Witch of Wall Street. Right? So unlike Grace Cortlandt, who called herself proudly the Witch of Wall Street, Hetty Green didn't like being called the Witch of Wall Street. This was applied to her by her critics. She was sometimes called the Hoarder of Hoboken. She lived for many years in Hoboken, in just rented apartment building. She would walk down to the ferry and take the ferry down to Wall Street in the morning, where she had offices at a bank, where she would oversee her investments. And that was something else. People considered her to be very cheap because she didn't like to spend money. She liked to make money. So she was the kind of person who had money like a Vanderbilt or an Astor. So it's like, why isn't she living in a mansion on Fifth Avenue? She thought it was a waste of money to have a mansion and employ servants and things like that. She'd just live in a simple apartment building in Hoboken, and she would have more money to invest that way. So, there's one of the things, to a certain extent, it was a strategy. She had massive cash reserves, which a lot of these other men didn't, because they had it tied up in all kinds of property and things like that. So when there was a financial panic, she had money to go and buy things, which other people didn't necessarily have on hand the way that she did. But I say her detractors labeled her the Witch of Wall Street, and they accused her of being selfish and greedy and lacking the proper soft feminine virtues of compassion and modesty. And she always wore black. She was a Quaker. She was brought up as a Quaker. So she said, I'm a Quaker. We just dress simply, and we don't like to spend money on fashion and things like that. But it was like, oh no, look at her and her. And the thing is, she would also wear a dress until it fell apart, and then she'd buy a new one. So you catch her on a day like this, it's like, yeah, she looks a little witchy, right? But slide. That's a more flattering picture of her, right? She looks a little bit more grandmotherly here. But Green was clearly the victim of a sexual double standard. As the New York Times remarked in its obituary of Green in 1916, quote, if a man had lived, as did Mrs. Hetty Green, devoting the greater part of his time and mind to the increasing of an inherited fortune, nobody would have seen him as very peculiar. It was the fact that Mrs. Green was a woman, and made her the subject of endless curiosity, comment, and astonishment. Slide. Green was seen as a respected financial authority, and this is an advertisement for some article she published in a women's magazine about why it was important that women should know about business, should not be ignorant about business. But she could never overcome the sexist prejudices against a woman behaving like a man, that is wrapped up in investments, contracts, and lawsuits. And she was suing people right and left, right? She did not like to feel that she was ever being cheated by a man. So, and not behaving like a proper Victorian woman, devoted to her husband, her home, and her good works. And she always kept her money separate from her husband's, whose business sense she didn't trust, rightfully so, because he wasn't so good at it. And people would ask her, like, what does your husband think about, like, these investments you're making? And she goes, oh, bless you, son. He doesn't know anything about this, or I don't listen to him. So, again, she didn't even make any pretense about that. So other women who achieved financial fame often went to great lengths to project a more acceptable, a less threatening public personas than Hetty Green. Slide. And this is a case in point, Ella Rawls Reeder. For a brief moment in the early 20th century, this 30-something company promoter from Alabama was celebrated as a brilliant financier. Reeder was careful to present herself as more conventionally feminine in appearance, deportment, and values. She dressed fashionably and cultivated the gracious and languid manners of a Southern belle. In interviews, she disavowed personal ambition, insisting that she only wanted to help others, especially her family. So she sort of dressed almost like a debutante. And newspapers are constantly contrasting her to Hetty Green. Right? Like Hetty Green is this old hag in her black rags, and is forthright and aggressive, and here's this genteel Southern woman, and she had this whole backstory that she completely made up, right? About, oh, my family, we lost everything in the war between the states, and I was forced to go to work, of course as a lady I didn't want to, but I was forced to go to work to try to help out my family, and it was all nonsense. But given the kind of attitudes people had about women workers and women financiers, it was savvy on her part to do that, right? To construct this more, this less threatening kind of persona. And so the press often compared Reeder favorably to Hetty Green. So for example, just give you an example, the Boston Herald pointed out that both women knew how to make financial coups, but only Reeder knew how to wear gowns, right? According to the paper, quote, Mrs. Green is shrewd-looking, right, Hetty Green, careless of her dress and unattractive. Mrs. Reeder is another individual. She does not resemble at all the usual conception of the businesswoman. She is fair, with a suggestion of faint pink coloring. She wears wonderful gowns. Right? So poor Hetty Green had to put up with this, right? She could have played the game. She just didn't care, and she was so rich she could do whatever she wanted to. So if Hetty Green was the witch of Wall Street, then Ella Rawls Reeder was its fairy queen. All right, so what I want to kind of end with is looking at how things started to change in the 20th century and how opportunities opened up for women in finance in the 20th century, and there was opposition to women in investment was decreasing in the early 20th century, and some of the reasons for this. So, slide. World War I was a big turning point, right? During the war, the United States is in the war in 1917, 1918. Of course, the war had begun in Europe before that, in 1914. But during the war, many more women were hired by banks, insurance companies, and other business corporations to replace men serving in the military. And most of these women kept their jobs after the war. The story we often tell about World War I and World War II, like Rosie the Riveter, women who worked in factories and made munitions. Once the war was over, they were all fired, and it's true they were. But for women working in offices in World War I, that wasn't the case. And women working for banks and women working for insurance companies in World War I, because in the 20s, as you know, Wall Street took off. And there was a huge expansion of banking and finance in the 20s. So these business corporations, they could hire all the men back who had been in the military, and they could keep the women on. And they could keep hiring more women, which they liked to do because they didn't have to pay them as much. So there was this big expansion of women in finance during the war that continues during the 1920s. But an important wartime innovation, which this slide illustrates, was the issuance by the United States of more than $20 billion in government bonds to finance the war. And European countries had been doing this, as well. Women played a huge role as both purchasers and seller of war bonds. So the United States didn't call them war bonds. We called them liberty bonds, right? We're selling liberty. Almost 1 million women sold war bonds in the United States from 1917 to 1919, which constituted American women's biggest contribution to the war. That is, there were a lot more women selling war bonds than working in defense plants. And these were mostly middle-class women, as opposed to the women working in defense plants were mostly working-class women. War bonds also introduced many women, and men, frankly, to the fact that money could be made by the simple process of holding paper securities until they went up in value. So the bond sales during World War I helped to set the stage for the stock market boom of the 1920s. Before the 20th century, a very small percentage of Americans owned stocks and bonds. But in the 20th century, and certainly during the 1920s, it becomes a big percentage. And of course, it's remained a big percentage to the present day. Slide. In 1920, American women finally got the vote, giving them full rights of citizenship. More women were going to college and entering business than ever before. Businesses were eager to attract women customers, as this New Jersey bank ad from 1920 demonstrates, from the East Orange Bank on Main Street, Hollywood Avenue. I wonder if that's still there. I have to check that out. I'm sure the building's still there. Slide. More women had money to invest, and they were hungry for advice. New Jerseyan Mary Wilbur published this book in 1910. It contained a wealth of information about stocks and bonds, legal contracts, mortgages, and interest rates. Note that Wilbur had taught political economy at Miss Dana's School for Girls in Morristown. So clearly the wealthy New Jerseyans who sent their daughters to Miss Dana's school in the early 20th century, they did not object to their daughters learning about banking and learning about investment and things like that in a way that maybe an early generation would have thought it was inappropriate for girls to have that kind of education. Slide. During the 1920s, stock exchange firms like banks wanted women's business, and they targeted women through advertisements and by hiring women brokers. So I'll end with this example of Marjorie Sweet. In 1926, the Newark brokerage firm Hambleton and Company hired Sweet, a young woman from Orange, to sell securities to women of New Jersey. In her first year, Sweet acquired 92 customers. A Wall Street firm, Throckmorton Company in New York City, poached Miss Sweet from Newark and placed her in charge of a wide territory in New Jersey. By 1928, she had 150 customers. The New York Times profiled Marjorie Sweet in 1928, depicting her as a kind of Wall Street flapper. According to the Times, quote, "She is petite, blue-eyed, and wears bobbed hair." The paper quoted Sweet matter-of-factly explaining, quote, "I have a little car, and I drive around nights after the girls get home from work and talk securities to them." Right. So I'll conclude by emphasizing that pioneering women brokers like Marjorie Sweet, along with countless early women investors, broke economic and cultural barriers and made it possible for women today to have greater economic equality and greater financial opportunities. Okay, thank you. And we have time for questions. If people have questions, and yes, sir, you have a question.
You mentioned the year 1852. What were the type of support systems, the education that were in place for women at that time? Because I imagine that was a real turning point in the evolution of women's rights.
Yeah, so the first women's colleges are opening up in the 1840s and 1850s. So that's of course, very few women went to college. Very few men went to college in the 19th century. But that was seen as important. The first women's colleges are opening up then. And there are some opportunities for women, maybe a little bit later, especially after the Civil War. A lot of business corporations began to hire women in clerical positions, right, as secretaries. because you could pay them less than men. But they also were seen as better. They were seen as neater and more efficient, and they didn't come in drunk on Monday morning and things like that. So yeah, you do see as a kind of a turning point then.
Was there special women's magazines?
Yes.
That really were advocates?
Yes. So women's magazines were, there were a lot of women's magazines. Some of them were advocates, some of them weren't. Some of them were more conventional and conservative, and of course, women's magazines then as now often had a lot of stuff on like recipes and homemaking tips and things like that. But they also, some of them did start to say, well, yes, most women will be married and be housewives, but that doesn't mean that they shouldn't understand about business and finance. Because what if their husband dies? They have to wrap up his affairs. They have to look out after his money. You don't want your daughter to be cheated by somebody if you're not around to look after her interests. She needs to be able to protect her children's interests. So yeah, you will see that in women's magazines in the 1870s on. There being more of an emphasis on, yes, that women do need to have greater educational opportunities.
Magazines that were dedicated to that type of philosophy or approach.
A Ladies' Home Journal, right? Which I think is still around, isn't it? Yeah. So that goes back to there and other magazines, So like Harper's Weekly, that was a family magazine, right? It wasn't just geared towards women, but since it was a family magazine, it would have ladies section in it, and children's section and things like that. So that would be another magazine that also would be sympathetic about, let's give the ladies some new opportunities. So yeah. Thanks. Good questions. What else? Yeah.
Yeah. This is sort of vague in my mind, but was there not also a worry, maybe expressed like in some of these advice manuals and magazines and so on, but I'm also thinking of like the genre of the social gospel novel, where women who don't understand about finance are like easy targets for evil men to maybe like seduce them, not only in a sexual sense, but also in a financial sense. Come with me, I'll take all your inheritance from your dad, invest it, and then she's broke.
Yes.
And that was like a warning.
Yeah, so there were a lot of novels like that written in the late 1800s, not by famous people, but they were novels who were popular at the time, and yes, and so, but they're open to various interpretations. So the Wall Street financier was a very sinister character, sometimes shown as Jewish. There actually weren't that many Jewish brokers, but of course, in some of this literature, they were depicted as such. But they also were always depicted as literal and figurative seducers. So they would they would rape the women, or they would seduce them in some way sexually, but also cheat them out of their money. But so some of the morals of these stories are, because of this, don't have anything to do with Wall Street. Do not have anything to do with Wall Street. If you have money, invest it in property, in real estate. Buy a house. Don't buy stocks and bonds because it's too dangerous and it's too risky. But then there are other novels there's another narrative that, well, you can't avoid investment. That's such an important way to make money, and some investments are legitimate, so you just have to be able to be careful about how you do it, and therefore you need to know more about how to do it. So yeah, absolutely.
The idea of exploitation, still of abolition movement, women's movement coming together, was there a sort of coalescing of ideas that had been exploitation movements both regarding slavery, abolition, and women and their rights not to have their own property? That's a good point, right? So the women's movement, the earliest women's movement in the United States grew out of the abolitionist movement. So most of the early women's suffrage advocates and women who were advocating for equal property rights for women, most of those women had gotten their start by advocating for the abolition of slavery. So there definitely are connections there. So it's like, greater equality for everybody, for black people, for women, So there's definitely a connection there. It's not always they don't always make it literally, but there definitely are connections there. How active were the Stanton and Susan B. Anthony in the movement?
It's interesting you should bring that up. So when Victoria Woodhull opened her stockbroking firm in 1870, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony were running a newspaper, a pro-women's rights newspaper. And Susan B. Anthony went to interview them at their offices. And for some reason, Victoria Woodhull wasn't there, so she interviewed Tennessee Claflin. It was a very lively interview where Tennessee Claflin is like, we're just showing that women can do whatever men can do, and why shouldn't, it's a lot better for a woman to make money selling stocks than teaching piano for $10 a quarter or sewing drawers for 25 cents a pair or whatever. And Susan B. Anthony is very boosterish about this, these are these women, this Victoria Woodhull and her sister, they're leading the way, they're real pioneers. Though at the same time, she also goes into great length describing what Tennessee Claflin is wearing, her matching hat and everything like that. So the woman was being just as sexist as the man, and looking at that to the female. But so initially they were very positive, but once Victoria Woodhull became the center of a lot of scandal involving her personal life and she ended up having very socialist views. Then women in the women's rights movement really wanted to distance themselves from her, and Susan B. Anthony felt very much that Victoria Woodhull was a liability, that she had embarrassed the women's rights movement by her personal conduct. So they certainly distanced themselves from her, but they continued to support and advocate for women to work in banking and stockbroking and things like that. But they had to be careful because the minute any woman tried to be a stockbroker, the first thing the press would do is another Victoria Woodhull. It's no, I'm not like her. Yeah, so they had to try to somehow separate themselves from her. So yeah.
How long did it take you to write your book?
Oh Lord, too long. So 10 years, I guess. But it's the thing is, I'm teaching full time at William Patterson. I just retired this year. But you're teaching full time, so you really had the summers to work on it. So and the research is the fun part. It's fun to find all these great examples. The dull part is sitting down and writing it. So
did you get a lot of information online?
Because of the digitalization of newspapers, so it's in places like the New York Historical Society and some of these archives, I was able to find some of these surviving records from stockbrokers and things like that. But it's online. You can find so much doing newspaper searches. Once you have a name of someone, you can find a lot of information. So
Seneca Falls, is there any real discussion at that time in Seneca Falls about women having financial independence?
Yes, because 1848, which was the year of Seneca Falls, 1848 was the year that New York State passed a Married Women's Property Act, a few years ahead of New Jersey, and the women at Seneca Falls were aware of that and they celebrated it. So they probably didn't have much to do about it, but they were supportive of it. So obviously it was an organized women's movement, was pushing for these things, but there were a lot of progressive male politicians who were sympathetic to giving married women control over their own property, and some of it was for very selfish reasons. Like, you're a man who has a lot of money and your daughter gets married, maybe you don't trust her husband, and maybe you want, I want that money to go to my grandkids, and I want to save it so that my grandkids can get it, and therefore I want my daughter to have control over it and not her husband, who might go and waste it in his business or something like that. So that there were reasons for men to support these laws as well.
Karl Marx's associate Engel was a strong woman's advocate, I would think. How much did his voice impact in the women's movement in this country?
Very little, because the women's rights movement was very desperate to maintain respectability, and they didn't want to be associated with socialism. And that was another problem for Victoria Woodhull. She was a socialist, and I guess not everyone knows that, as a little bit of trivia, but the first English language version of the Communist Manifesto was published in the United States in Victoria Woodhull's newspaper. So that was another reason why it's Victoria Woodhull, she supports free love, she's had multiple husbands, she's a communist. It's the women's movement didn't want to be associated with that. So I'm sure they would have agreed with everything that Friedrich Engels said about the equality for women, but they didn't want to, It's like, no, we're good Christian women. I mean, the women's movement in the United States was firmly rooted in Protestantism. It's like, we're good Protestant Christian women. And we're not trying to overturn society. We're simply looking for what's fairness, and giving women equality is good for everyone. It's good for the family. It's good for our children. It's good for society as a whole. So they did not want to be seen as being radical, even in many cases when they were. So, but yeah. Well, great. Thank you so much. These are great questions, and thanks again for coming out on this rainy day. So.